Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into some sources you've shared, and they're all about emotional intelligence.
EQ.
Yeah, EQ. And to kick things off, I think a really good illustration of just how powerful emotions can be comes from a story that's actually in one of the sources. It's about this guy, Phineas Gage, who back in the mid-1800s was a foreman on a railroad construction crew.
Oh, I've heard of him.
Yeah. So picture this, he's overseeing this blasting operation, and suddenly there's this freak accident, and a 3-foot-long iron rod gets launched right through his skull.
Ouch.
Yeah, seriously. Ouch. I mean, it went in one side of his head, not the other.
So he didn't make it right.
Actually, that's the really crazy part. He survived.
Yeah.
Not only did he survive, but right after the accident, he was actually coherent, talking to people. But then things got really interesting.
I bet.
Yeah. This guy who was known for being dependable and well-liked, he basically underwent this total personality change, became impulsive, erratic, someone his friends barely recognized.
So this really bad accident somehow changed who he was as a person.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point. Emotions aren't just these fleeting things. They're deeply tied to our brains, and they shape who we are, how we interact with the world.
That totally makes sense. But I think a lot of times we sort of underestimate the power of emotions.
Yeah, we tend to think of them as these separate things from our thoughts and actions, but the reality is they're all intertwined.
I guess that's where emotional intelligence comes in.
Right. And that's exactly what all these sources are about, EQ. Not just about being nice or empathetic, but a foundational skill that impacts literally everything we say and do.
So it's like a core skill that underlies pretty much everything in life.
Exactly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive for you.
Yep.
To really unpack what EQ is all about, why it matters, and most importantly, what you can do to actually boost your own emotional intelligence.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people might think, oh, I'm either emotionally intelligent or I'm not.
Right. But the good news is EQ isn't some fixed trait you're born with. It's something you can absolutely develop and improve.
Okay, so it's like a muscle you can strengthen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're going to break down the key insights from these sources to give you some really practical strategies you can actually use.
So let's jump right in.
All right, so one of the first things in the material emphasizes is just how central emotions are to our everyday experience.
It mentions that on average, we have something like 400 emotional experiences every single day.
400. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing when you think about it. We're constantly reacting emotionally to things, whether we're fully aware of it or not.
And the sources make the point that because of this, because emotions are so ingrained in our experience, focusing on EQ, it's not just like tweaking one little thing.
It's more like tending to the roots of a tree.
Right. When you strengthen your EQ, it impacts all these different areas of your life.
It's like a foundation for so many other skills.
Exactly. So let's get into some of the specifics. One of the most crucial aspects of EQ that the material highlights is self-awareness.
That's basically your ability to really accurately perceive your emotions in the moment and understand your own typical patterns of behavior.
So it's kind of like having this inner radar, right? Recognizing when your emotional temperature is rising and also just understanding your go-to reactions.
Right, like knowing what kinds of situations or people tend to push your buttons and what helps you feel at your best.
Exactly.
Mm.
And the material makes the point that becoming truly self-aware, it's not always a walk in the park.
Yeah, it takes a willingness to confront those uncomfortable feelings, the ones we might naturally want to avoid.
So it's about getting really honest with yourself.
Right. But why is self-awareness so important for the rest of our emotional intelligence?
Well, from what I'm gathering from these sources, it's basically the foundation. When you're self-aware, all those other EQ skills become a lot easier to use.
So it's like you can't build a house without a strong foundation.
Exactly. You're more likely to make good decisions because you understand your strengths and motivations, and it helps prevent those emotional hijackings where you just react without thinking.
Oh, I totally been there.
Yeah, me too. And the sources point out that the tricky thing about emotions is they're often wired in. They can kick in before our rational brain has even had a chance to catch up.
So it's not like we can just switch our emotions off.
Right. We need to become aware of them in order to manage them effectively.
And another interesting point they make is that when we try to ignore our emotions, they don't just disappear.
It's like that annoying notification on your phone that keeps buzzing till you actually deal with it.
So they can resurface later in unexpected ways.
Exactly. And often at the worst possible time.
Okay, so we've established that self-awareness is super important.
Absolutely. Now, the material also mentions that emotional intelligence can actually be assessed. There's something called the emotional intelligence appraisal.
But without making anyone take a test right now, What are some of the more observable signs of someone with high EQ?
Like, what does it actually look like in real life?
One really important thing the sources emphasize is that people with strong EQ, they have this really rich and nuanced emotional vocabulary.
So it's not just about saying I feel good or I feel bad.
Right. They can identify their emotions with much greater specificity. Like instead of just saying I'm stressed, they might say I'm feeling overwhelmed and a little bit anxious.
So it's about getting really specific with those feeling words.
Exactly. And the reason that's so important is because the more precise you are with your language, the better you understand what's actually going on.
It's like if you're trying to fix a computer problem, you need to know the specific error code.
Right. Otherwise, you're just shooting in the dark.
Exactly. So the more specific you can be with your emotions, the better equipped you are to actually manage them.
Okay, so we're starting to get a picture of what high EQ looks like.
But the material is also really realistic. It acknowledges that developing these EQ habits, it's not always easy.
Yeah, they make it clear that it takes real courage and commitment.
Because sometimes it means confronting those parts of ourselves that we'd rather just avoid.
And changing those ingrained patterns of behavior can be tough.
But it's reassuring to know that even people with really high EQ, they still have their buttons that can be pushed.
It's not about becoming this emotionless robot.
Right. It's about developing the skills and the awareness to manage those emotions effectively so they don't control you.
And to use both your heart and your head to make good decisions.
Exactly. Now, the material also gets really practical and gives a bunch of strategies for how we can actually improve our EQ.
Like specific things we can start doing today.
Exactly. So let's dive into some of those.
Okay, so the first one is actually incredibly simple. It's breathing.
Breathing. We do that all the time.
Right, but the idea here is to be really intentional about it. The sources describe it as the simplest way to make stress more intermittent by bringing your awareness to the present moment.
Can you give us a really quick example of a breathing exercise someone could try?
Sure, just take a minute or two and just focus all of your attention on the sensation of breathing in and out. Notice the air as it enters your lungs and then as it leaves your body. If your mind starts to wander, which it probably will, just gently bring it back to your breath.
That sounds super easy.
Yeah, and even just a minute or two of this can have a surprisingly calming effect.
Like a mini reset for your nervous system.
Exactly. Now, another strategy they talk about is mindfulness.
Mindfulness, that's a word we hear a lot these days.
Yeah, but what it boils down to is basically a type of meditation that's been shown to help you develop greater control over your thoughts and actions.
So it's not just about sitting on a cushion and chanting.
Right. It's about learning to observe your thoughts and feelings without judgment, almost like watching clouds drift by.
And the sources say that practicing mindfulness regularly, it can actually lead to increased focus and concentration.
And it can help reduce that feeling of being overwhelmed or out of control, which is really helpful for managing stress.
So it's like a mental workout for your attention.
Yeah, exactly. Now, another really interesting point the material makes is about the importance of how we structure our free time.
So how we spend our time outside of work.
Right. It might seem counterintuitive, but how we use our downtime, it can have a huge impact on our emotional well-being and even our productivity at work.
So it's not just about how many hours we work, but also how we recharge.
Exactly. And one of the key things they emphasize is the importance of minimizing chores.
Chores, like laundry and dishes.
Yeah, because those things can easily creep in and take over our free time, making it feel like we're never really off.
It's like work that never ends.
Right. So the recommendation is to actually schedule chores just like you would any other important task. And if you don't get to them, it's okay to let them go.
It's about protecting that downtime so you can actually relax and recharge.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, the sources also have a whole section on how to be more likable.
Likeable. So is this about trying to be popular?
Not really. They actually debunk the myth that likability is just about having a charismatic personality or trying to please everyone.
So it's not about being the life of the party.
Right. They argue that likability is actually something we can consciously cultivate through our emotional intelligence.
So it's more about how we interact with people.
Exactly. And one of the key points they make is to actively don't seek attention.
So not trying to constantly be the center of attention.
Right, because people are often more drawn to those who are genuinely interested in others rather than those who are constantly trying to impress.
And they also suggest focusing on being sincere, transparent, and understanding in your interactions.
Those are the qualities people consistently rate as likable.
And they even recommend shifting the focus to others when you receive praise or recognition.
It shows humility and appreciation, which are both really attractive qualities.
Another really interesting concept they bring up is following the platinum rule.
So most of us are familiar with the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated.
Right, but the platinum rule takes that a step further.
It says treat others the way they want to be treated.
So it's about recognizing that everyone has different needs and preferences.
Exactly, and taking the time to really understand what those are.
It requires being a really good listener and observer.
And it shows that you genuinely care about the other person, which helps build stronger connections.
Now, speaking of connections, the material also dives into why forming strong relationships is so important for us as humans.
And they make the point that it's not just about feeling good, it's actually a fundamental need.
Like food and shelter.
Yeah, they even mention research that shows our brains process social pain, like the pain of rejection or loss, in the same area where we experience physical pain.
Wow, so being socially connected is literally wired into our brains.
Exactly. And they suggest some really practical tips for building stronger bonds, like using positive body language.
So things like smiling, making eye contact, leaning in when someone's talking.
Right. Those nonverbal cues can make a huge difference in how people perceive you.
And they also recommend being the one to initiate deeper conversations.
Like going beyond the typical small talk and sharing something you're genuinely passionate about.
Because that kind of vulnerability, it often encourages reciprocity and leads to more meaningful connections.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something a little less pleasant. Those people who seem to drain our energy.
The toxic people.
Yeah.
How do we deal with those?
Well, the sources are pretty clear on this. Toxic people create a lot of unnecessary stress, and stress, we know, has a negative impact on our brains.
It can affect our memory, our ability to focus, even our physical health.
And the material points out that a key characteristic of toxic people is often manipulation.
Like they might try to make you feel guilty or constantly play the victim.
Or they might be too much too soon in a relationship and then later act like martyrs.
It's all about trying to control you and the situation.
And they also mention the envious, those people who constantly try to downplay your accomplishments.
It's like they can't be happy for you because they're too focused on their own insecurities.
So how do we deal with these kinds of people in a way that protects our own well-being? The key is to focus on what you can control, which is your own reactions and boundaries.
So not getting sucked into their drama.
Right. And where possible, minimizing contact with those individuals.
Easier said than done sometimes, but it's about protecting your own mental and emotional space.
Now, on a brighter note, let's talk about happiness.
Everyone wants to be happier, right?
Well, the good news is the sources emphasize that happiness is not just about luck or circumstance.
So it's not like some people are just born happy and others aren't.
Exactly. Our emotional intelligence and our daily habits play a huge role.
So what are some of the things that happy people do differently?
They tend to be really good at savoring those small everyday pleasures.
Like that first sip of coffee or a beautiful sunset.
Right. They focus on gratitude and they actively seek out solutions to problems instead of dwelling on the negative.
They're also really in touch with their own emotions and they express them in healthy ways.
And maybe surprisingly, they prioritize getting enough sleep.
Sleep, that's so important.
Yeah. And on the flip side, they talk about some of the things that tend to make people unhappy.
Like what?
Constantly numbing yourself with technology, that endless scrolling.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that sometimes.
I think all are. And also adopting a victim mentality where you feel powerless to change your situation.
That can definitely lead to a downward spiral.
Yeah. And they make the point that experiences often bring more lasting happiness than material possessions.
Because experiences create memories and connections.
Exactly. Now let's talk about confidence, something I think a lot of people struggle with.
Is there a connection between confidence and EQ?
Absolutely. The sources emphasize that true lasting confidence is built on a foundation of self-awareness and emotional regulation.
So it's not about being arrogant or pretending you're perfect.
Right. It's about knowing your strengths and weaknesses and being able to manage your emotions effectively.
And that allows you to show up authentically and confidently in the world.
Exactly. And some of the things confident people tend to do is they listen more than they speak because they don't feel the need to prove themselves.
And when they do speak, they do so with certainty and conviction.
But without being aggressive or dismissive of others.
It's about that balance of inner strength and respectful communication.
Now, another important quality that ties into EQ is mental strength.
Mental strength.
Yeah.
So what exactly is that?
Well, the material talks about this concept of grit, which is basically a combination of passion, perseverance, and resilience.
So it's about having that inner drive to keep going even when things get tough.
Right. And they argue that grit is actually closely linked to emotional intelligence.
Because you can't really be mentally strong if you're constantly letting your emotions control you.
Exactly. So mentally strong people tend to be really good at keeping their emotions in check and making those tough decisions, even when it's uncomfortable.
And they don't shy away from challenges. They see them as opportunities for growth.
Now let's talk about something that can be really challenging, dealing with lies and dishonesty.
Ugh. Yeah, that's never fun.
And unfortunately, it's more common than we'd like to think.
So what's the emotionally intelligent approach when someone's lying to you?
Well, the tricky thing is there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
It depends on the situation.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize that emotional intelligence helps us to carefully consider our options and choose the best course of action.
So it's about using your self-awareness and your relationship management skills to navigate those tricky situations.
Right. And sometimes it's about picking your battles, knowing when to address a lie and when to let it go.
Now let's talk about something that's crucial for learning and growth, developing a growth mindset.
Have you heard of Carol Dweck's research?
Yeah, she's done some amazing work on mindsets.
And the material highlights her findings that people with a growth mindset, they believe they can develop their abilities and intelligence through effort and learning.
So they're not limited by their current skills.
Right. And they see challenges as opportunities to grow rather than threats.
And the cool thing is the sources say that high EQ individuals tend to have a growth mindset.
Because they're self-aware enough to recognize areas for improvement and resilient enough to persevere through setbacks.
So it's about embracing that journey of continuous learning.
Exactly. And some of the things they suggest for fostering a growth mindset is to actively avoid staying helpless when you encounter a challenge.
It's not giving up easily.
Right. Analyze the situation, learn from your mistakes, try different approaches.
It's about being persistent and solution-oriented.
And also doing your homework, putting in the effort to really understand things.
And being authentically yourself rather than trying to be someone you're not.
Now let's switch gears and talk about something that's absolutely fundamental to our well-being: sleep.
Sleep. It's like the magic elixir.
And the sources make a really strong connection between good sleep hygiene and emotional intelligence.
Because when we're sleep-deprived, our mood, our ability to handle stress, it all goes downhill.
Right. We become more irritable, less patient, less able to think clearly.
And the material even mentions that sleep deprivation can mess with our metabolism and appetite hormones.
Which can lead to weight gain and other health problems.
So it's not just about feeling tired. It has a real impact on our physical and emotional health.
And they point out that a lot of really successful people, they prioritize sleep.
Like who?
People like Ariana Huffington, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, they all make sure to get enough rest.
So it's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of smart self-management.
And they also talk about the benefits of meditation for improving sleep quality.
Mindfulness strikes again.
Seriously, it seems to have benefits for pretty much everything.
Now let's talk about something that can have a surprisingly big impact on how we're perceived our body language.
You know that saying, actions speak louder than words?
Yeah.
Well, the sources say that's especially true when it comes to nonverbal communication.
So how we stand, how we make eye contact, all those subtle cues.
Exactly. And they mention research that shows people can form surprisingly accurate judgments about us based on just a few seconds of observing our body language.
So we're constantly sending out messages, even when we're not saying a word.
And positive body language, it can increase likability and trust.
While negative body language can make us seem untrustworthy or even incompetent.
And one really common negative habit they highlight is showing up late.
Being late, that's a big no-no.
Yeah, because it signals disrespect for other people's time.
So punctuality is definitely a virtue.
Now, what about that voice we all have in our heads, our inner monologue?
What about it?
Well, the material talks about the impact of negative self-talk.
Oh, you mean that inner critic that's always telling us we're not good enough?
Exactly. And they make the point that a lot of those negative thoughts, they're actually based on assumptions and limiting beliefs rather than objective reality.
It's about challenging those thoughts and questioning their validity.
Right. And they also suggest being really mindful of complaining because it can become a really ingrained habit.
It's like our brains get wired to focus on the negative.
And the more we complain, the more we reinforce those neural pathways.
So it's a good habit to break.
Now, a really central theme that seems to run through all of these sources is the importance of being authentic.
Authentic. So what does that mean exactly?
Well, as Oscar Wilde said, be yourself. Everyone else is already taken.
I love that quote.
Yeah, it's so true. And the sources define authenticity as basically living in alignment with your deepest values and beliefs.
So it's about being true to yourself.
Exactly. And they mention research that shows when we act inauthentically, it actually creates a sense of internal discomfort, almost like a feeling of moral violation.
So we literally feel bad when we're not being true to ourselves.
Yeah. And authentic people, they're often driven by a deep sense of curiosity and passion.
Passion. That's a powerful word.
And they define passion as this intense inclination towards activities that we love, that we consider important, and that we dedicate significant time and energy to.
So it's not just about being good at something, it's about that deep sense of meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And passionate people, they're often really good at managing their time. They have an optimistic outlook, and they bring a lot of energy to the things they care about.
Now let's talk about another really crucial skill for navigating life. Effectively practicing self-control.
Self-control. That's a tough one.
Yeah, but so important.
And the sources give some really helpful strategies for strengthening self-control, like paying attention to your diet.
What does diet have to do with self-control?
Well, eating foods that provide a slow and steady release of energy, like whole grains and lean protein, it helps to stabilize your blood sugar.
And that helps us resist those impulsive urges.
Exactly. And of course, getting enough sleep is also super important.
Sleep is the answer to everything.
Seriously, it's so crucial. And they also talk about the importance of self-awareness, noticing those moments when your willpower starts to waver.
And planning ahead for those tempting situations.
Right, like if you know you're going to be offered dessert, but you're trying to cut back on sugar, maybe decide in advance what you're going to say.
So you're not making a decision in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of self-compassion.
So not beating yourself up when you slip up.
Right. Everyone makes mistakes. It's about learning from them and moving on.
And finally, they talk about the anger funnel.
The anger funnel. What's that?
It's basically this idea that when we try to suppress negative emotions, they can actually build up and get channeled into anger.
So it's like a pressure cooker.
Exactly. And learning to manage our emotions effectively helps prevent those blow-ups.
Now let's talk about something that might seem like a positive quality, but can actually be pretty harmful: perfectionism.
Oh yeah, I know a few perfectionists.
And while it's great to have high standards, perfectionism can really hold us back.
How so?
Well, it can lead to procrastination because we're so afraid of making a mistake.
And it can make it hard to delegate because we think no one else can do it as well as we can.
And it can also make us super critical of ourselves and others.
So it's like this constant pressure to be perfect, which is impossible.
Right. And in reality, it often leads to more stress and less actual accomplishment.
So it's about finding that balance between striving for excellence and being okay with good enough.
Now let's delve into something that can be really helpful for understanding ourselves and others better: personality.
Personality. So how does that fit in with EQ?
Well, the material clarifies that personality is different from both IQ and EQ.
So it's its own separate thing.
Right. It's basically your stable style, those ingrained tendencies and preferences.
Like whether you're introverted or extroverted.
Exactly. And while your personality doesn't directly determine your EQ, understanding your personality can be really helpful in developing your EQ.
Because you can tailor your strategies to your specific strengths and weaknesses.
And they give an example of some characteristics often associated with conscientious people.
Like what?
They tend to hate waiting, they value things being done right, they often multitask, and they can have trouble relaxing.
So very organized and detail-oriented.
And they also mention this concept of ambiverts.
Ambiverts.
Yeah, it's basically people who have a blend of both introverted and extroverted tendencies.
So they can kind of switch back and forth depending on the situation.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something that might seem a little sneaky: increasing the perception of intelligence.
So is this about trying to act smarter than you are?
Not exactly. It's more about understanding that how intelligent others perceive you to be can actually be really important in life.
Even if your actual IQ stays relatively stable.
And the sources emphasize that emotional intelligence plays a big role in this.
Because when you're emotionally intelligent, you often come across as more thoughtful and capable.
Exactly. And they give some really practical tips for appearing more intelligent.
Like what?
Making good eye contact, using precise language, speaking clearly and concisely, being decisive, and even dressing professionally.
So it's about presenting yourself in a way that projects confidence and competence.
Now, on the flip side, they also talk about some common phrases that can make us sound less intelligent.
Oh, like what?
Things like saying, "you look tired," or "that's not my job," or constantly hedging your statements with "I think."
So it's about being mindful of our language.
Exactly. Now, what's interesting is the material also delves into why even really smart people sometimes do things that seem, well, not so smart.
We all know people like that.
Yeah, and research suggests that it's often because our intuition can sometimes override our rational thinking.
So we go with our gut, even when it might be wrong.
And they mention overconfidence and multitasking as two common pitfalls that smart people can fall into.
Because they might overestimate their abilities or think they can juggle multiple things at once.
But in reality, that often leads to mistakes and decreased productivity.
So even if you're super smart, emotional intelligence and mindful attention are still crucial.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about how we can make smarter decisions in our lives.
Because we make a ton of decisions every day.
Tons. And the sources recommend slowing down and listening to our intuition, but also balancing that with logic and reason.
So it's not about just going with your gut or just being overly analytical.
Right. It's about using both.
And they also talk about being mindful of our physical reactions.
Sometimes our body gives us clues about what feels right or wrong.
And they even suggest analyzing our dreams.
Our dreams?
Yeah, because they can sometimes offer insights into our subconscious.
That's fascinating. And they also highlight a bunch of cognitive biases that can distort our thinking.
Cognitive biases, what are those?
They're basically mental shortcuts that our brains use to simplify information, but they can lead to errors in judgment.
Like, what are some examples?
The halo effect, the horn effect, confirmation bias, the availability heuristic, anchoring cognitive dissonance, and the power of names.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. But basically, we need to be aware of these biases so they don't lead us astray.
Exactly. Now let's talk about relationships.
Everyone's favorite topic.
And the material draws on the work of John Gottman, who's done extensive research on what makes relationships last.
And what has he found?
Well, he's identified these 4 really destructive patterns of interaction that he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Dramatic.
Yeah, and they are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling.
So basically all the things that make your partner want to run for the hills.
Pretty much. And to counteract these negative patterns, he talks about the importance of repairs.
Repairs?
Yeah, it's basically taking specific actions during a conflict to de-escalate tension and move towards understanding.
So it's like damage control for your relationship.
Exactly. And some of the key steps for making a repair is taking your own emotions out of the driver's seat, focusing on understanding your partner's perspective, and communicating with respect and a willingness to find common ground.
So it's about being willing to take responsibility for your part in the conflict.
And they also talk about the importance of teaching emotional intelligence to children.
So they can build healthy relationships from a young age.
Right. And a lot of that comes from modeling those behaviors ourselves.
Now let's shift gears and talk about leadership.
What makes a great leader?
Well, the sources emphasize that great leaders, they don't just manage people, they really lead them.
So what's the difference?
They see the big picture. They play chess, not checkers. And they recognize the unique strengths of each individual on their team.
So they're not just trying to fit everyone into the same mold.
And they're also incredibly good communicators.
They know how to articulate a vision, inspire others, and build trust.
And they're genuinely likable.
Likeable leaders don't have to be aloof or tough.
Right. It's about connecting with people on a human level.
And ultimately, leadership is about balancing a focus on both people and results.
Now in our busy world, everyone's always looking for ways to be more productive.
How can we get more done without burning ourselves out?
Well, the sources highlight the importance of having a really great morning routine.
Like what kind of routine?
Well, they recommend starting your day with some form of exercise.
Exercise first thing in the morning.
Yeah, it actually has tons of benefits. It boosts your energy, improves your mood, helps you focus.
And a lot of successful people swear by it.
And they also recommend practicing mindfulness or meditation in the morning.
To clear your head and get centered.
And they talk about the importance of not seeing life as a zero-sum game.
Meaning what?
That one person's success doesn't have to come at the expense of someone else's.
Oh, okay. And being willing to ask for help when you need it.
It's a sign of strength, not weakness.
And biting your tongue when you're tempted to complain.
Because negativity is contagious.
Now, what about those habits that can actually sabotage our careers?
Oh, there are a lot of those.
And the material talks about the negative impact of bad bosses.
Because a bad boss can make your life miserable.
And it can lead to health problems, stress, anxiety, even depression.
And they actually list 7 common types of bad bosses.
Like what?
The micromanager, the credit stealer, the bully, the passive-aggressive boss, the constantly unavailable boss, the know-it-all, and the one who plays favorites.
And they give some tips for dealing with each type.
And they also emphasize the importance of overcoming toxic working relationships.
Because those can really drain your energy and impact your well-being.
Now, they also talk about some seemingly paradoxical habits of really successful people.
Paradoxical, like what?
Well, they say successful people are often confident yet humble.
So they believe in themselves, but they're not arrogant.
Right. And they're willing to take risks, but they're
Yeah.
also